I'm going to try and cover 2 points. First is a bit of a discussion about what is the investment need regarding gigabit-capable networks, a little bit then about the investment gap, and then finally some questions around the fair share debate. Starting with the investment need, my organization, WIK Consult, was asked to conduct a study for the European Commission on the costs of meeting the digital decade targets. We looked at a number of scenarios. On the fixed side, we looked at what was the cost of deploying full fiber to all premises, and also what was the cost if we used fixed wireless access to some of the more remote premises. When it comes to mobile, we looked at what is the cost of deploying basic 5G, just upgrading the existing 4G sites with 5G capability. We also looked at the cost of deploying so-called full 5G, involving standalone networks and a degree of network densification. But please note, network densification, full 5G as it's described, is not specifically set out in the digital decade targets. And last but not least, we looked at the cost of covering transport paths. So what was the result of this? First of all, I'll explain a bit how we arrived at the figures. We used a bottom-up cost model that WIK has developed in the context of regulatory or support for regulators in setting prices, wholesale prices. We had detailed information for Germany, so we used that as a basis to understand what the costs were of different technologies in different types of areas. We then extrapolated the results to other regions within the EU. And in doing that, we took account of how much infrastructure there already was, so how much fiber, how much 5G. We took account of the population density. We took account of differences in the cost of capital, and also, when estimating the required subsidies, the ARPU. Important note, this is a very high-level estimate. We were looking at estimated costs at NUTS 3 level, and that aggregates quite a few areas together. So I'm going to apply a bit of a warning to the results. You can see it as providing an indication at EU level, but I don't think that you can rely on that to calculate an estimate on a national basis. You would need, as the Italian authorities have themselves done, to take a more in-depth, detailed look to arrive at national figures. So what were the results? On the fixed side, we estimated that it would cost, across Europe, around 114 billion euros to deploy full fiber, and subsidies of around 40 billion euros might be required. It would be cheaper if instead of covering the last few houses with fiber, you covered them with fixed wireless access. So under that scenario, we end up with a lower cost of 108 billion euros to deploy fiber to the home with FWA in the last few percent, and the subsidy required would also be lower. When it comes to mobile, we concluded that the cost of upgrading 4G to basic 5G would not be very significant, and that minimal subsidies would be required. On the other hand, to densify networks for just one 5G network, it would be around 33 billion additional euros, and there would be some subsidies required of around 3 billion. We also concluded that it would be cheaper if you deployed fixed and mobile together. What was the overall result? Well, you've probably seen the figure of 174 billion euros. That's what happens if you add up fiber to the home everywhere and you don't deploy fiber and 5G together, so you're not taking advantage of synergies. If you do take advantage of synergies and you deploy mobile networks using the fiber network, the core aspect of the fiber network that you have rolled out, the cost could be significantly lower. around 146 billion euros, according to our estimate. It would be lower still if you rely on fixed wireless access for the last few percent. And we didn't take into account the potential savings you could make if you implement the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive effectively in a particular country. That could lower the cost further still. So that is the investment need. What is the investment gap? Much of what I'm describing as the investment need should, in theory, be commercially viable. Subsidies are only needed in areas where the revenues don't cover the costs, including the cost of capital. So what is the investment gap? The investment gap, I would say, is the subsidy requirement, which could be somewhere between 33, 43 billion euros, maybe more, bearing in mind that our estimate tends to underestimate this amount. And it would be the difference between that and the amount that's already been committed. So around 19 billion of EU funds have already been committed. And in addition, there's been a lot committed in national state aid. We note that in Italy alone, around 11 billion euros have been committed. This should mean that Italy, along with other countries that have allocated significant amounts of public funding, should be well on their way to meeting the targets. I will finish with just raising a few questions around the fair share debate. First is on cost causation. There have been claims that content and application providers cause costs, and they're not compensating for the costs that they are causing. But are they? If you're looking at the access network, the content is something that is requested by the end user, and also when the end user requests it, if they don't have a fiber network, typically they will be streaming at a lower resolution than those that have a fiber network. There could also be an effect on revenues. If you wonder why we don't have more take-up of fiber networks today, it's perhaps because consumers don't see the point. But then you might need more applications to be developed, particularly bandwidth-intensive applications, to encourage users or to persuade them that they need to pay more for services. That doesn't only apply for fiber, but also, importantly, for full 5G. On the transit side, we can see that content and application providers are increasingly delivering traffic close to the customer. They're co-locating with ISPs in many cases, and in that sense, they are covering their own transit costs, or indeed, content delivery networks might be doing this on their behalf. And also, the cost of incremental traffic on the core network continues to decline. Next, I have some practical questions. How would a payment scheme from content and application providers towards telecoms operators work? What should happen in countries where there isn't a gap, where there isn't a funding gap? Should there be some kind of rebate from the content and application providers? How can we guarantee that money will be spent, for example, on completing fiber coverage, or indeed on densifying 5G networks? Densification is not in the digital decade targets. There are not always obligations to do that in spectrum licenses. Another question, who is investing in the networks, and therefore who should receive the money? It's maybe not only incumbent operators, but there are also important alternative fiber investors. And on the mobile side, there are towercos, as you've heard from in this event earlier. What about alternative solutions? Are there alternative solutions to address a gap, to the extent that one exists? Well, the most obvious one is probably EU funding or state aid. And the important thing about using that mechanism is there are guidelines in place that make sure that the money is channeled to the right people, that there are conditions attached, and so on and so forth. Now, both EU funding and national state aid are directly, or indeed indirectly, funded by taxpayers. So I will end with one final question. Are the big content and application providers paying enough tax? Now, I think there the jury is perhaps more out. We know that there are issues with multinational companies exploiting the locations in which they report revenues and profits to minimize their tax bases. There is, as far as I understand, a system being considered under the OECD, the Base Erosion and Profit Sharing Project, which could lead to additional tax payments from the large caps to EU member states. If that is implemented, that could in turn replace digital service taxes included, which have been introduced in countries such as France. If there is additional tax from the content and application providers, through whichever mechanisms, those tax receipts could support additional state aid for broadband in cases where it's needed. So those are just a few observations. I'd be interested to hear others' views.